In the bustling city of Chittagong, tucked away near the Karnafuli River, some people whispered about a peculiar clockmaker. They said his intricate creations kept time not with springs or gears, but with the very breath of the water itself. For years, the man had owned one of these unique pieces, a small desk clock whose delicate hands danced to a nearly imperceptible hum, a rhythmic whisper he'd come to associate with the steady pulse of life around him. Then, one Tuesday morning, as dawn broke over the city, the man woke to an unsettling stillness. His eyes snapped open, instantly searching for that familiar, comforting hum from the clock. Nothing. It wasn't just quiet. It was an absolute absence of sound. The steady tick-tock, the gentle whir, all had vanished. He leaned closer, pressing his ear to its ornate casing, but met only an impermeable, profound silence. This wasn't merely the muffling of sound. It felt like the very concept of auditory sensation had been erased. Just for him. He tried to speak, but his voice too was gone, a mere vibration in his throat. A chilling dread began to coil within him. That was strange enough, but then, in the extreme edge of his peripheral vision, a faint, static-like smudge seemed to appear and instantly vanish, as if a tiny tear had momentarily opened in the air itself. The perfect silence broke with the dawn. The man coughed, a sudden, raspy sound that felt alien after a full day of absolute nothingness. He had never appreciated noise so much. Relief washed over him, a wave of desperate gratitude, but it was fleeting. His gaze drifted to the mantelpiece. The clock was still, its hands frozen. More unsettling, the strange, static-like smudge that had appeared yesterday was gone. He picked up the clock, turning the winding key, listening for the internal whir. Nothing. He shook it gently, tapped its ornate casing. The gears remained stubbornly locked, the mechanism unresponsive to his desperate efforts. Hours passed, the sun tracking across the sky. He tried again and again, his frustration mounting into something colder. As twilight bled into the room, a familiar faint shimmer began to coalesce on the clock's face. The smudge, a silent gray smear, slowly reappeared, solidifying with the creeping darkness. At the same moment, the frozen hands of the clock jerked backward by the neighbor noticed the man's fixed, distant stare, his unblinking focus on the silent timepiece. The air around the man felt thick, heavy with an unspoken dread. The neighbor asked if everything was all right, but the man only mumbled, his eyes glued to the returning horror. The neighbor left soon after, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. The man was alone again, facing the returning blur, the silent promise of another perfectly quiet day. The oppressive silence, once a heavy cloak, now felt like a shroud actively stifling his senses. First, a sound that made the man's blood run cold. A soft, familiar call from beyond the closed bedroom door. "My darling," it cooed, clear as a bell, undeniably from within. It was the voice of his long-lost mother, a sound he hadn't heard in decades, echoing from an empty room. The man stumbled backward, heart hammering against his ribs. That was strange enough, but then a small, plaintive cry, "Papa," seemed to emanate from the very depths of the locked cellar, a place no child could possibly reach. The man, frantic, clawed at the sturdy wooden door, his breath ragged, but only hollow quiet met his desperate pleas. The auditory manipulation was now undeniable. On the mantel, the frozen clock twitched backward another minute. The man suddenly froze, head cocked to one side, a faint, lilting tune, a half-remembered lullaby, seemed to drift from just outside the second-story kitchen window. It was a voice the man knew. The house, once just unnaturally still, now pulsed with phantom echoes, each one a crueler twist, slowly but surely unraveling the mind caught within its increasingly wrong walls. The man pushed open the kitchen door, but the floor beneath his feet was wrong. No longer the cracked yellow he knew so well, but a strange, mottled green, damp to the touch. He blinked, stepped back, then forward again. The tiles remained, alien and cold. He moved further into the house. The living room's familiar fireplace had vanished, replaced by a wall of dark, unfamiliar wood, slick with condensation. Every threshold now felt like a portal, twisting known spaces into unsettling, distorted facsimiles. A memory surfaced suddenly. Remember when we built that secret bookshelf here? The thought felt completely natural. Your uncle helped us, just last summer. The man's blood ran cold. He had no uncle. He had no uncle. No secret bookshelf. He turned to question the fleeting thought, but his surroundings were already shifting, leaving him scrambling to find the way out. He tried to retrace his steps, but each turn led him deeper into a house that no longer made sense. He called out. The only response was the growing silence. The man was utterly alone now. The impossible architecture closing in, and the true horror of his predicament beginning to dawn. The man stumbled through the familiar hall, desperation a cold knot in his gut. He pushed open the door to his study, only to find it was now the cramped guest bedroom. Furniture shifted, wallpaper a different sickly shade. He spun around, trying to retrace his steps, but the hallway behind him had inexplicably narrowed, its length stretching beyond reason. He moved faster, each room he entered twisting into something else, a disorienting labyrinth of familiar yet utterly alien spaces. His own home was actively betraying him. He staggered to a window, needing to see the outside, to ground himself in reality. He yanked aside the curtain, but instead of the familiar city street, a vast murky jungle canopy stretched out, choked with ancient silent vines, unnaturally still, under a bruised alien sky. He tried another window, this one in what was once the kitchen, and it displayed not the neighboring building, but the deep, churning, silent waters of an abyssal ocean, dark and hungry. Instead, he found himself standing in the small, rarely used pantry, the front door utterly gone, replaced by a solid wall of canned goods. He tried again, slamming into a back door that should lead to the garden. It only opened into the bathroom, the shower curtain still drawn. The house was a living, breathing trap. When he looked down, the clock's hands had shifted again, pointing to a time that could not exist. And through it all, the terrifying, perfect silence persisted, unbroken by a single tick. The man's world began to unravel in unnerving ways. First, it was small, personal things. A cherished locket, a family heirloom, vanished from its usual spot by the bedside. He searched for hours, convinced he'd simply misplaced it, only for a cold dread to grip him weeks later. The locket reappeared, impossibly embedded in the plaster of the living room wall, as if it had grown there. The frozen clock sat directly beneath it, as though the object had been placed there as an offering. Other items followed. A worn photo of a loved one, carefully kept in a leather-bound album, reappeared glued face down to the bathroom mirror. Then a child's drawing, framed and hung proudly, was found resting upside down on the kitchen ceiling, secured by nothing visible. The man's home, once a sanctuary of memories, now felt like a cruel, shifting puzzle, mocking his sense of history. One evening, staring into the bathroom mirror. The man's own face seemed to ripple, to almost melt. For a heartbeat, the reflection wasn't quite right. A faint, static-like smudge flickered across the glass, like interference on an old TV screen. The air in the room grew heavy, chilling his skin. It was as if his very self was being questioned, rearranged by an unseen architect. The world outside felt less real than the profound dread consuming him. The man had lost his sound, but now time itself seemed to turn against him, bending and breaking without explanation. He'd find himself mid-sentence, only to realize he'd just uttered the exact same words moments before, a short loop of reality playing out again and again. Then, just as suddenly, entire hours would simply vanish. He'd glance at the clock, then look away for a breath, and when his eyes returned, the hands had lipped forward, leaving him with a chilling, empty space where memory should have been. That was strange enough, but the house, his familiar sanctuary, began to betray him too. A segment of the wall by the fireplace suddenly held a small, stained glass window, a design that belonged in a different century, perhaps even a different continent. An ancient, heavy wooden door, carved with symbols he didn't recognize, now stood where his simple pantry door had been. Each discovery was a silent scream, an artifact from a reality that wasn't his. The clock no longer measured hours. Memories, old and forgotten, began to resurface, but they were tainted. He saw a fleeting shadow in the background of his earliest childhood photos, a subtle, cold presence at the edge of his vision during a long-forgotten dream. It was as if something had always been there, patient and unseen, weaving itself into the very tapestry of his past, making him question not just his present, but every moment he had ever lived. The man found himself humming, a tune soft and low, that stirred a deep forgotten memory of his own mother. He paused, frowning, the sound still vibrating through his chest. He hadn't chosen to hum it. His throat had simply produced the melody, unbidden, as if guided by an invisible hand. A tremor of ice slid down his spine. This was more than just a trick of memory. It was an invasion. Later, a phrase spilled from his lips, a gentle reassurance, exactly what his late wife used to whisper when he was troubled. He heard it, clear as day, resonating in the empty room. But he hadn't intended to speak. And the voice, it was undeniably his, yet it carried an unnatural, hollow perfection, like a recording played back in an empty cavern. When he tried to recall the conscious thought behind the words, there was only a void, a chilling absence. But then things got worse. The true horror wasn't just in his body betraying him, but in his mind, his internal monologue, the very essence of his self, began to fray. What is there left to lose? He would try to resist, to push them away, but they would simply become his thoughts, a twisted, insidious logic he couldn't deny. The man was no longer sure where he ended, and where the creeping influence began. His own self was slowly, relentlessly, being unmade. The air inside the house grew thick, not with dust, but with something almost palpable, like heavy dark water pooling in the mind. Walls began to stretch, to ripple and sigh, no longer rigid plaster and wood, but muscle and sinew, responding to an unseen internal pulse. What were once sturdy doorways now seemed to gape, soft and damp, like raw, exposed orifices, beckoning into darkness. The glass in the windows dulled, then hardened into black, unblinking eyes that stared out into nothingness, or perhaps into the very heart of the cosmos. The very structure groaned, a deep, resonant sound that felt less like settling wood and more like a gargantuan ancient creature drawing a profound, agonizing breath, its architecture twisting, fluid, and organic. Within this horrifying metamorphosis, the man felt his own mind unravel, a terrifying process of internal erosion. The familiar edges of his thoughts blurred, individual memories and fears dissolving like sugar in tea, a profound, terrifying desolation as his individual consciousness, his very I, receded further and further, swallowed by an immense alien awareness. The internal space where his self once resided became a cold, vast cavern, now echoing with a presence that was ancient, boundless, and utterly, terrifyingly triumphant. There was no more him, only the vessel, silent and perfectly still, perfectly receptive. The house breathed, and it breathed with something new. The man's body, once a vessel of thought and fear, became something else entirely. The last flicker of his own mind, the final echo of a whispered hope, simply dissolved. There was no struggle, no scream, just a quiet, profound emptiness settling in behind his eyes. No one knows why it chose this method, this slow, silent invasion, but the result was undeniably complete. The once familiar room now held a chilling new presence, a stillness that hummed with a strange, victorious energy, absorbing all traces of the former occupant. Through the man's unblinking gaze, the world slowly, deliberately began to unfold. Colors appeared starker, light more intense, each detail sharper than any human eye could ever truly perceive. The worn wood of the table, the dust motes dancing in sunbeams, all were observed with an alien clarity, stripped of all human meaning or emotion. A subtle tremor ran through the floor, a rhythmic vibration that was the distant river, now felt through bone, not heard through air. The clockmaker's clock on the wall, its intricate gears frozen, stood as a monument to what had ended. An absolute stillness, cold and complete, filled the space where a life once was. This was not the man seeing, but something ancient, finally witnessing the world through an empty shell. Behind him, the clock's hands completed their final movement and began ticking once more. Far away, somewhere along the Carnifuli River, another river-powered clock abruptly fell silent.